We thought the visual work that we were utilizing had the same value as the music that we were exacting. So it was almost as if that cover artist was part of the group for that session. That's how we thought about it. You know, will you jam with us? You know, what do you have?
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Thurston Moore is one of the most influential figures in rock. Alongside the likes of Kim Gordon and Lee Ronaldo, he is associated with Sonic Youth, one of the definitive art rock bands. And I do mean art rock. Sonic Youth album covers famously spotlighted artists, from Gerhard Richter's unforgettable painting of a candle on the cover of 1988's Daydream Nation to works by important or soon-to-be important artists including Raymond Pettibon, Mike Kelley, Marnie Weber, Richard Prince, and others. Well, Moore has just put out a very cool new solo album. The title is Flow Critical Lucidity, and true to form, the image he's picked for it is a literal work of art, showing a metal helmet studded with tuning forks instead of spikes. This low-key, surreal image is a photo of a sculpture called Samurai Walkman, and it's by the artist Jamie Nares. Nares herself is a big deal. She just had a film retrospective at MoMA, and her fantastic work called Street was the first film ever to be projected on the exterior of the Metropolitan Museum of Art back in 2020. As it so happens, Thurston Moore did the soundtrack to that film. The two have a long history together, having both come up in the no-wave scene of the 1970s. Thurston Moore, Jamie Nares, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Likewise.
I am so genuinely excited to be talking to you both about this album and art pairing on Critical Flow Lucidity. And it's particularly exciting because it's really organic. You two really have a history with one another, which opens into this whole history of the way rock and art have collided in New York and beyond. But I want to start a little before you meet. You know, you both came to New York at about the same time, at a really interesting time in New York art history. So tell me what drew you both to New York.
Jamie came a few years before me. I don't really settle in New York with an apartment of my own that I rent until early 79. 76, I started going in and I started seeing gigs and hanging out and going to like bookstores and record stores and seeing gigs at CBGBs and Max's and stuff. But I didn't really get my own place until the spring of 79. Before that, I'm sleeping on artist floors. I started playing in a band with some young graduates from Rhode Island School of Design, who were like the next class after Talking Heads people, David Byrne and crew, and meet them sort of randomly in a record store in New Haven, Connecticut, when we trade addresses and we start writing to each other. And they invite me to come to New York and play bass guitar with them. I never played a bass guitar in my life, but I told them I did. That's how that started.
Yeah, I love that. I've been reading Sonic Life, and your dad taught art to a certain extent. So you had Warhol background, and Lou Reed is really important to you. So there's this like magnetism to New York drawing you in.
My father was an art appreciation professor, so there was always art prints in our house. It was strange going to other people's houses my age in the early 70s and not seeing any art in the house. And I was wondering why. I was like, how come they don't have Picasso prints in their house? Because my father put those all over our house, and the Impressionism prints around our house as well. And so I figured that was just standard practice, but it didn't exist in any other household. And there was no music either. There was no piano. My father had a piano. There was lots of classical music. So I knew that we were at odds with the typical templates of society, I guess. So when I met these artists from Rhode Island School of Design, and they were all part of this gang around Jenny Holzer and Michael Glear and these artists who had come to New York, and they were all sort of banging around together. And I didn't know what that scene was. And my father was an art professor, but for some reason, he never told me that art school was a alternative. And so when I went to university, I went just for journalism because I thought I wanted to be a writer. Well, I did want to be a writer, but nobody told me that you could actually go to art school. You would think my parents would have told me that. So I went to New York, and that was art school. And so meeting all these artists, crashing around with these artists, people like Jamie, they seem to live these charmed lives, when I moved there. And seeing them walking around with their canvases under their arms. I don't know if you were strutting around with a canvas under your arm.
Yeah, did you feel like you were living a charmed life in New York in the mid-'70s, Jamie? You came from London.
Well, to some extent, yeah, because I had come from London. I had always subscribed, in every sense of it, to American art magazines, especially more underground magazines, Avalanche, those kinds of things that were like gold bullion to me. If I was carrying anything around under my arm, it would have been a copy of Avalanche magazine, more than a canvas, I think. I
didn't get around to smoking a cigarette on the cover. You know. Very sexy magazine.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, I bought that issue of Avalanche just the other day for a couple of $100 as opposed to whatever it was when I first subscribed to it.
It's really interesting because you both you're not born in New York, but you're consuming the legend of New York. You're part of the legend of New York, but you're drawn there by the legend of New York.
Like most people who make a life in New York, we all come from other places.
Yeah, you realize in New York City, when you do go there to sort of find your vocation, that's where you went. There was no other ways of connecting. There was no digital realm. There was no internet. So you knew that's where the art world was. You knew that's where like the radical music was being made. And that's where like the interesting post-war avant-garde writers were. And that's where you went if you were interested in these kind of more marginalized disciplines in art and music. And it was either New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or London or Paris, Berlin or Tokyo. But, you know, New York was in some ways, it was like the Godhead city of contemporary art disciplines. But you realize that you weren't indigenous. I mean, the indigenous music of New York was more like salsa music and people who had grown up in the streets, more sort of immigrant families, Latino families and African-American families. That was kind of curious. And of course, that music was just as radical. The Latino music, the salsa music was completely radical. African-American music from R&B to disco to hip-hop was always just this radical music. In some ways, hip-hop was the only real radical music that kind of cracked the mainstream more so than any other kind of avant-garde music.
Sure, which is popping off at the same time that you're putting together your early stuff, right?
That was the beauty of it, going there in the mid-'70s, and then it was all about creating a complete new identity away from the fallout and burnout of like Vietnam 70s, you know.
Speaking of which, Jamie, I think you moved in 74, something like that, from London?
I came in 74, yeah.
And you have a pretty well-known art video now called Pendulum from the mid-'70s, was shown in Greater New York biennial some years ago, and really captures, I think, for people, the sense of like the city at that time, which was this creative canvas people could work on.
You know, yeah, that film does capture that sense, and it was almost through no design of my own. I just wanted to string up this big thing and see what it did.
Yeah, it's like a huge pendulum in these empty streets in Soho, right? Around J Street.
It's in Tribeca. I lived in this bridge that went across the street. Not many of those in New York City, and I was lucky enough to have one. And I strung it up. I swung this thing and filmed it for a couple of weeks, and then recorded a separate soundtrack where I attached the microphone to different harmonic points on the cable that was suspending this large weight. And that became the soundtrack. It sounds like the creaking of an old ship's rigging or something. But I hadn't thought of the implications of time and the passing of time and the swinging of the pendulum. Somehow those notions, the more symbolic notions of a swinging pendulum, were secondary to my thinking. I just wanted to see this big thing moving around. But with age, it has a crude meaning of a depth that really makes me feel very good. It hasn't faded with time. It's just sort of stood its ground.
That film is so beautiful because it's this kind of sentient, moving postcard of New York in 1974, 75. I mean, you could smell that street. Yeah. You know, when I moved down there, I know exactly this structure that Jamie was living in. It's still there, I believe. It's a bit of a bridge walkway from one building to another, like down in Tribeca, which Tribeca is triangle below Canal Street, which is below Soho. So it's even deeper. I was living down there too. Like that's where I was couch surfing at the time in 76, 77 with the RISD guys. It was in Tribeca, almost down towards John Street and Water Street and this whole area that's the, what do you call it, the sea.
South Street Seaport, yeah.
That was sort of our zone. You know, the building I lived in, it was where Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman were upstairs above us. And nobody was famous, so it wasn't sort of like, wow, Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman above us. It didn't really matter. The film director who did Hurt Locker.
Catherine Bigelow.
Kathy.
Yeah, she was part of that scene.
Yeah, she was down there. She was living below. She was working as an assistant for Vito Acconci when he had his place in Dumbo, which is where we first started rehearsing and stuff. But everybody kind of like banged around there. There was a couple of bars. There was one called Puffy's, and there was one called McGovern's.
Barnabas Rex.
Barnabas Rex. So, you know, we would all sort of see each other. You know, I kind of knew that you were an artist or a musician, and you would be kind of a little snooty to each other. You'd have to really be introduced and sort of maybe say a few words and be at the same party maybe before you really got to know each other. I mean, I didn't know Jamie until many years later when I was researching with Byron Coley an oral history, that book that we did on no wave music scene. And I sat down with Jamie and I was able to interview Jamie, and we realized that we had this interlaced history.
You passed each other in the streets on the South Street Seaport or in Tribeca or whatever.
I don't know if he remembers me. He was so regal.
I remember you very well because you used to come to our cinema.
I did, yes. I used to go to the No Wave Cinema, Super 8 Cinema.
I remember Thurston from the New Cinema, which was a cinema I opened up with Eric Mitchell and Becky Johnston, who went off to Hollywood to make films and made a reputation for herself there. It was a little storefront, really, on St. Mark's Place. And Thurston used to come there.
Yeah, I was a bit of a loner. What made me interested was there was a sign outside once that said that there were some films by Michel Oder with music by Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and the Contortions. It was actually a film of the Contortions. I just thought that was incredible that somebody actually filmed the Contortions, first of all. And second of all, that they were actually showing the film, you know, for like a $3 entry fee or whatever it was. And you would go in there and it was
no freebies.
There was no freebies. You're lucky there was a folding chair that was functional and you would sit in it. The projector would be in the middle of the room just clacking. You know, it would just be against some kind of screen that was purchased at like a Woolworths, and everybody was kind of smoking cigarettes, you know, and it was just like a smoky room. And there would be this incredibly wonderful grainy film of the Contortions, just like violent on stage. And so that to me what drew me in at first. And then I started hearing more about the films that were being made sort of genre-wise as no wave cinema, you know, that was featuring some of the musicians, so like James and Lydia Lunch and Adele Bertai. And they were the actors and actresses in these films that Jamie was making and that Eric Mitchell was making. And then Beth and Scott B. And I used to go to Beth and Scott B's loft and they would show their films there, like Letters to Dad and you know, and everybody would go there, you would sit around, you would see these perverse films that were really sort of nihilist but at the same time hilarious. And by the time I found my apartment on East 13th Street, I was just really sort of left to my own means. And so I was just drawn towards what was happening. I wasn't really searching it out. It was just there.
Oh, what is that?
Black box.
That's me doing
That's you, yeah. Serves you right to suffer.
Yeah.
What is this? What is this that we're looking at here?
That's a poster for the Peas movie, Black Box.
It was their take on the U.S. government's torture exploits.
Yeah. And of course, torture had a lot of credibility, a lot of street cred in torture in those days. And
there were some great lines like, "Shut up and suffer," or something like that.
Yes.
It was almost like making fun of this kind of demonic reality that was happening in like the political world. And
it was the only real weapon that we had to confront it with.
This is when New York is bankrupt. And that's what Pendulum captures, a kind of bleakness to everything. I mean, it's crappy and there's a lot of freedom, but it's also pretty bleak. How did it feel?
You feel like you're on top of the world to begin with.
Yeah, you felt like you were off the grid of surveillance. So it was sort of like the city was kind of left to its own device. Famously, let it rot. It was a playground apocalypse, you know.
Gerald Ford to New York City, dropped dead.
Right, that's right then.
Remember that New York Post headline? That instilled a sense of pride.
It was such a perverse place to live at that time because there was not that much sort of police paranoia, and it wasn't really subject to what the rest of the world was subject to. You sort of like felt like you were in a lunatic asylum.
It did feel like New York City was so saturated with crime that there was no room really for the cops to worry about whatever anything like we might be doing, because it seemed insignificant in terms of crime and punishment. So there was a freedom that came with that whole, it was a kind of laissez-faire thing. You know, the cops were almost like your friends on the street within reason.
Sure, yeah.
But there wasn't such a separation as there was between law enforcement and artistic enforcement. At least not if you were a young white artist.
There's this kind of like free fall in New York. And then there's a kind of everything's mixing up in new ways. Because when you describe the music scene you came into, Thurston, it does seem like art was in the mix in like a way that at different moments when the genres are more solidified.
The music scene was completely interdisciplinary. Jamie was a guitar player in contortions. You knew that certain musicians in some of these bands were also painters, sculptors, filmmakers. There was no one discipline that had any more kind of imperial value over the other. You really felt like everything was of equal value, no matter what you did, as long as you did it with some serious intention. But that was already in the air anyway. That was something that was already gleaned from the era of Andy Warhol and his factory. And even before that with like, you know, Cage and Merce Cunningham and everybody doing interdisciplinary art pieces, you know, Robert Wilson. And that was already established. All we had to do was just sort of take that reign. And I think the big difference in our culture in the mid-'70s onwards, especially in punk culture, was that there was more of a gender balance that I don't think any sort of previous art culture could really claim. What was happening in female culture and male culture, there was less of an imbalance there. In fact, in some ways, with punk culture, the female vision, the female voice, or the feminist vision, the feminist voice, was so prominent, so prevalent. The key players were women. That wasn't really looked upon as being odd. It was incredibly empowering for all of our aesthetic. The strongest voices were Patti Smith and Lydia Lunch and Debbie Harry and Susie Sue. And, you know, even in the art world with Lisa Bear and the total acceptance of sexual persuasion of having, there was nothing other about it anymore. It was a very progressive forward moment. And it continued to be. And I think it still kind of defines a lot of people's thinkings. You know, even now when I see 15-year-olds, they embrace this aesthetic of punk because punk, it's all inclusive.
It was a kind of golden age of collaboration across, like you were saying, across genders, genres, disciplines, persuasions, educations, class. None of the divisions in society seemed to count for much. And that was incredibly liberating in that it freed us up to try this and try that with this person and that person and see who you happen to fall into bed with that night and what came out of it. It was an incredibly fertile cross-pollination of ideas. And what was really great, you didn't even have to try. You just had to make a decision to be part of it and to open the door and walk out onto the street, and you were part of it. And you couldn't avoid it. If you decided to be in New York City at that time, in that place, especially below 14th Street, 23rd Street at a stretch, but there was this center of gravity that fell somewhere below 14th Street.
The community that you were involved with had really sort of figured things out on a cosmic level, too. I mean, it was just sort of like, maybe the rest of the world will catch up with us someday. The idea of just like being sort of transcendent of any kind of notions of classism or racism or sexism to such a degree, almost as if you were just like, how is it that the rest of the world doesn't know this? And we're still dealing with that. I mean, when you look at sort of the political climate now, it's just like, my God, it's so extremist, you know? It's like, how can you be that primitive in your thinking? I mean, we'll always be tribalist. There's nothing you can do about that. We're animals. There's always going to be sort of tribalist nature in our world. But my God, I mean, when it comes to sort of inclusivity, it's just like, get with the program.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about no wave, because that's sort of where two interests of yours really meet. There's no wave cinema and no wave music, and there's a famous no wave festival at Artist Space, so art's in the mix as well. So what was no wave, and what did it mean to each of you?
The artist Michael Zwack is the one who curated that no wave festival at Artist Space. It was just called Bands at Artist Space. So it was like a very sort of direct statement. You know, a lot of it had to do with this really sort of kind of almost explosion of banality in a way. It was like bands at Artist Space. What else do you have to say about that? Nothing. It's just bands at Artist Space. And it was like these bands that, you know, had these names that were just kind of jarring. It was certainly informed by punk rock, but no wave was concurrent with the advent of punk rock. The first no wave music coming out of a band like Mars, who were originally called China. Lydia was doing a Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, which originally was called The Scabs, with her and James Chance, and then Bradley Fields comes in. It's all happening in 76. I mean, they're doing their first shows in 76 at the same time that people are hearing about Ramones and Patti Smith and Blondie and Talking Heads and television and that kind of holy grail of, and there's so many other bands as well. And not all of them are that great. Some of them were pretty cool, but not all of them are that good. There's a lot of kind of just lame, kind of trashy rock and roll stuff. But
isn't that the condition for the good stuff, though? I mean, I feel like that's what a lot of people don't have, to have the freedom to fail today. You know, that's what all that trash buys you, is the space to fail many times. You know what I mean? Every garden needs a few weeds.
When you played in the Contortions, it was what year? I mean, it was 76, 77.
77, yeah. I'd come out of this art background and had been to art school in London and never fit in there because I was always interested in things that nobody else seemed to be. So I came to the place like everyone else. We used to call it Ground Zero, way before World Trade Center or anything. That triangle below Canal Street was Ground Zero, because that's where the Russians would drop the bomb if they decided to bomb us. So it was Steve Mudd who really sort of talked that one up. But I had come here, I'd made art, I'd made my films, my pendulum films, works that were very indebted to all the minimalists and conceptual artists that were living in the neighborhood and who I had come here to be amongst. And there was this kind of dissatisfaction that struck.
Were you going to see music?
Not at the very beginning. I was making music of a sort, but I didn't start going to see music until more like 76, CBGBs. And then, of course, there were loft parties with people making music and all the rest. But music had always been an important part of my life. And there came this time where suddenly music seemed to have a little more going for it, or it seemed to address larger and more prescient issues than were addressable within the art world or any other. But all that shifted very quickly, very rapidly, and anything became possible very quickly. It was just this incredible mixture. But I personally dropped what I was doing. I dropped my filmmaking and my art making, and James asked me if I would play guitar in his band. And I think he did that because he liked the way I looked more than anything else. He'd certainly never heard me play guitar.
Well, yeah, you looked fantastic.
I looked fantastic.
Yeah, you did. Somebody yelled at me across the street in Avenue A in like around 78, 79. Like, hey, James. And I turned around and they were like, oh, never mind. And the person I was with sort of tugged on my shirt and said, like, I think they think you're James Nares, because I was tall and we had the same haircut. A little younger than you. You were much more suave and sophisticated looking than I was.
I don't know about that. Of course, people yelled, hey,
Thurston at you. I thought you were very stern. You had been around the block. I was a bit of a puppy, so I was a little scared of you. It was.
It's amazing the difference that a couple of years can make when you're young.
So you already touched on this, but when actually did you meet officially?
The official meeting of Thurston and Jamie, you called me up about the book.
A History of No Wave?
We knew of each other, and I think Jamie knew about Sonic Youth through the years. I think Sonic Youth's profile put me in a place where I was so active for so many years that I wasn't really even in New York that much because I was on tour for like 20 years. So in some ways, I think a lot of people from Jamie's world around New York saw the trajectory of Sonic Youth as being part and parcel of like the New York story. But we never really connected in a familial way until later. The only people I knew from that scene that I became really close to were certainly Lydia, who I was playing music with by the early 80s, and James Chance to some degree. We were friendly, but it was not like we hung out or anything. Arto Lindsay to some degree as well, because our bands would play together. You know, he would always have some kind of new thing going on. I became very close to Mark Cunningham from Mars because we had mutual friends, and so we became very friendly. But that was about it.
So Sonic Youth, probably the classic art rock band. And in terms of these crossovers between art and music that we're talking about, I do feel like it's your album covers where it's like that is such a symbol of that, because I feel like there are contemporary artists from that time that probably are known through their Sonic Youth covers as much as anything else. You know, when Mike Kelley passed away, there were articles in rock magazines calling him Sonic Youth cover artist Mike Kelley, which blows my mind. The relationship between image and song is really interesting for you, Thurston. And I just wanted to, since we're talking about an album cover, just ask you how you think about that.
Well, I mean, Sonic Youth was through and through a downtown New York City art rock band. I mean, we were truly a band that was comprised of at least two working visual artists, Lee Ronaldo and Kim Gordon. My involvement with both of them was through the art world anyway. I was already in a band with other visual artists, and we were called the Coachmen. Like I said before, I never went to art school, so I never considered myself an artist coming out of academia at all. But I was very interested in being an artist in some ways. It was in music composition and just thinking about music, and performance was where that expression came to fruition. But I was completely drawn towards people in the art world, and those became my family. I think when Sonic Youth first started, the very first record we did, it's a mirror image of the group. There's two photos of us where it looks like there's 8 people on the front of the cover. But it's a mirror image, and it was completely informed by work that Dan Graham was doing at the time with like mirrors. Dan Graham would do this work where he would actually stand in front of a wall-sized mirror, and the audience would be sitting on the floor behind him, and he would be staring at the mirror, and he would be describing what he was seeing in the audience. You know, there's a young man with short hair, his hands are folded on his lap, and he's looking at the person next to him. And then you become very self-aware with this Dan Graham performance as an audience member. It was an incredible exchange. It was an incredible performance. And at that time, Kim was already involved with working with Dan at that time before I even knew her. So I had first started working with a young woman who was involved with Vito Acconci. The group started out with her. Her name was Anne Demarinis. Maybe Jamie, you remember Anne Demarinis. She was also music director for a while at the Kitchen Center. She lived and worked with Vito Acconci for a while, and she was in different groups. And I started playing music with her. And then Kim came in, and then Lee came in. So these were artists that I was playing with. And I never thought anything about it. It was through osmosis that I felt like I was part of the art world through them. So the idea of like our album covers using different artists, it was never any sort of intention of just like trying to exploit a celebrated artist, because most of the artists that we used at the time were not celebrated within the art world so much. Even Mike Kelley was still a bit of a marginal artist when we did Dirty. He became a blue chip artist pretty soon afterwards. Same thing with Raymond Pettibon. Pettibon was just an artist, illustrator who worked with punk rock bands on the West Coast like Black Flag. But we saw in his work something that was like really wonderful. We actually introduced him to Mike Kelley, and they became fabulous compatriots. In some ways, Pettibon wasn't really involved with the art world at all. He had his own kind of micro community of working within his brother's band, Black Flag, and just doing record covers for them. Then the art world discovered them, and a lot of it had to do with us putting him on our record, Goo. We felt like it was part of our community, pretty much of a micro community. We thought the visual work that we were utilizing had the same value as the music that we were exacting. So it was almost as if that cover artist was part of the group for that session. That's how we thought about it. You know, will you jam with us? You know, what do you have? I mean, the second record we did, Confusion is Sex, is an illustration that Kim had just done on the back of a piece of paper that I kind of slapped down on a Xerox machine, and there was the album cover.
I guess music videos, which are kind of a lost art now, are kind of the other place where image met sound. And all kinds of people say that music videos came out of experimental film or, absorbed a lot of that energy. Do you see any of that, Jamie?
Yeah, I think that people making music videos ended up employing a lot of low-budget filmmakers because the aesthetic fit. And because the low-budget film makers, the no-wave filmmakers, the downtown underground filmmakers were the ones who were being the most innovative, whose techniques, whether intentional or not, gave birth to a whole new way of looking with the camera and editing and all the rest. A whole new kind of filmmaking, really. It didn't start with us. It was another mantle, I think, that we picked up, but we ran with it. And rock videos were in their infancy. It made sense to employ people whose way of thinking was also in an infancy of a kind. It was a good fit.
Yeah, I always think they're the most organically like dreams, This is really experimental mainstream form of film where it's like sort of organically surrealist, the thing in a dream where you keep moving between different spaces, but it's not weird. Like, well, that's just a normal music video.
Jamie, do you have any inclination to do any film work utilizing TikTok?
It's so funny you should say that because I had been thinking for a long time now about how to recreate that performance I did at the Kitchen in 1977, Delirium Probe, where I patched myself into a TV and switched at random from one channel to the next, and then relayed what I was hearing and seeing that nobody else could see or hear what I was experiencing. It was a performance that had significance of some kind at the time, but I've never been able to figure out a way to redo it. And I was thinking about that again lately, and I realized that it's been done. People are doing it all the time, every day, everywhere now. TikTok, it's where you scroll from one thing to the next, and it's a kind of fragmentation of consciousness that makes perfect sense to most people nowadays. It's like life is a fragmentation of one's consciousness, which seemed a very alien idea back in 1977. When I plugged myself into a TV set in Joe Jonas's Love.
Jamie, maybe talk about this artwork for Flow Critical Lucidity is a work by you, Samurai Walkman. I think it's from 1988, is that right?
I think that's right.
What's the original context?
Well, first of all, I got to say how thrilled I was when Thurston let me know that he wanted to use that as the cover for this beautiful album with the beautiful title. It's a great album cover, I think. It goes beyond whatever I was trying to do. When I made it, actually, it has a very specific beginning. I went to see around that time an exhibition of ceremonial samurai warriors' helmets. And these ceremonial helmets were built like a regular helmet, but they had some sort of attribute of one kind or another culled from the world around us. Something that the warrior felt they could fight under, a banner or a principle for which they would be prepared to lay down their lives or fight, or at least that's the way I interpreted it. But the attributes were as obtuse as like a scroll or a butterfly, things which you wouldn't particularly think of as being associated with a samurai warrior. And I liked that very much. I liked the show, and I thought, well, if there was something I was going to fight under, music or sound or whatever. So the tuning fork is a kind of symbol of music in a way. It's like song contained in substance. It's a piece of metal that sings.
It's an actual sculpture, the original piece, not just a photo.
It's an American helmet with tuning forks.
We saw it in your retrospective in Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee, yeah.
Yeah, I showed it there. Actually, I'd recorded quite a lot of recordings of setting the helmet up in my studio, like in a shooting gallery, and then shooting at it with an airsoft pistol. And it shoots like BBs, but large ones. And they're made of plastic. And I set it up and then shot at it from a distance. And I made these recordings, like bang, bing, bang.
Oh, so it's an actual musical instrument then, as well as a sculpture. How appropriate. So you have this new album, Thurston. You're known for your album covers. And what's the album about? Why did this image connect with it?
My wife, Eva, and I went together to Milwaukee, and we talked about it since then. You know, at some point, it would be wonderful to have Jamie's work grace one of the album covers forthcoming. And this was the one. And it just felt right because a lot of the music was written in contemplation, sort of post-COVID crisis situation of being in an artist residency that was centered around Lake Geneva and the Alps, and seeing that outside the window in this kind of locked room, writing this music. And Eva was writing some lyrics and words, and we were discussing what the visual was to this. And thinking about nature and man's engagement to nature in the contemporary sense. And a lot of people know of Jamie's artwork, which is sort of the large, graceful swaths of movement, like these waves of paint, this movement of stroke, paint and color on a canvas. That's what I was envisioning in a way. It was like, well, that's wonderful. That makes a lot of sense thinking about lakes and mountains and air.
Yeah, it's a very airy album. Yeah.
But we were looking at different pieces of work of Jamie's, and Eva pulled that one out, and I was like, oh, I never would have thought of utilizing a sculpture piece. But it was just like, oh my God, it's like, it's all about resonance. And the fact that it was this sort of underlying narrative of the warrior, it's sort of like it's a warrior of peace, a warrior of sound. In some ways, it was kind of this reclamation of this idea of being a warrior. It's like being a warrior of love. And so I thought it was just perfect.
That's so beautiful.
Well, because we're talking about album art, the last thing I just wanted to ask you is about album art. I noticed in the press release for this album that it's being released on streaming, but also there are bonus songs that are exclusive to the vinyl and the physical incarnations of it. And, you know, Sonic Youth, you've been so known for your association with art, Thurston. And I feel like these graphics, these images were works of art on their own that really brought people into music. I know you've curated shows about vinyl art, and I just wonder if you think that's a lost art.
I don't think it's art. I think it totally coexists in tandem with work in the digital realm. You know, I don't feel threatened by the digital realm or even threatened by artificial intelligence creating work, you know, that has no sort of human quality to it. I have no anxiety about this. To me, I think the physicality, the tangibility of artworks, you know, you can't really replace the vibrational. I like to sort of buy records because of how they feel. I like touching them. I like smelling them. I like looking at them. I like licking them. But, you know, listening to them is like sort of the last thing I'm interested in. I feel like I've already decoded that to some degree. It's all these other aspects that I'm interested in. I like filing them and collecting them and like seeing them in a library. Playing a record is like, I'll do it once in a while, but it's all these other aspects of tangibility that I'm interested in first and foremost. You can't separate your stems and seeds on a download. You know, it's just like, that's all there is to it, you know.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's a great place to end. All the many ways music can come together with other things. So, Jamie and Thurston, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Jamie, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, likewise. Much love.
That is it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review us. It does help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.